Hi, I'm Allie Hamilton, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the Come As You Are podcast. Every week, we'll be talking about some aspect of healing, usually around childhood wounds and complicated familial relationships. The topics will always coincide with my personal essay of the week, and this will be a place where we can take a deep dive together. I'm so thrilled you've joined me and delighted for you to always come as you are. Hi there. Hi there. Welcome to our talk this week. The topic is Out of Time, My Month in Another Dimension. And this is going to be a talk about grief and trauma and time. And what tethers us when the ground falls out. If you are a human being, at some point you're going to experience really profound loss. And so I was writing about the death of my mother and the month leading up to her death, which happened December 7th of 2021 at 3:37 a.m. And I was there holding her hand. And I wrote about the weeks leading up to that event because when I think about that time in my life, it really feels surreal and like it happened outside of time. And I think when we are talking about trauma is really defined as any time your nervous system is overwhelmed. So sometimes people think they've never experienced trauma. I've really never met anyone, of a certain age who hasn't. At some point or another in our lives, things will happen that are shocking and that are difficult to process. And everyone has different levels of resiliency as well. And so what might be really overwhelming for one person may not be as overwhelming for someone else, but chances are just being alive long enough, you're going to experience some point in time, if not many points in time, where your nervous system is overwhelmed. And, so much of the work that I do has to do with the nervous system and calming the nervous system and coming back to center. But no matter what you do, loss, like the loss of an entire person, it's a shock, even though we all know that we have expiration dates and everyone we love has expiration dates. We know we do not go on and on and on forever. It still feels impossible when an entire person is no longer available to call, to text, to see, to hug, to hear, to feel. I do feel my mother around me all the time, but it took about a year for that to be the case. The first year after I lost her I just was swimming in it. And some days I felt I could, get my head up above the water more easily than others. Some days I felt really just done in by it. But that month leading up to it is something that I really wanted to talk about because I think that we're all going to have those experiences that pull us out of our timeline. And I do think that we tend to think about time as linear and think about our lives like they began when we were born and, we're going along the timeline in this sort of linear organized fashion, moving forward, getting older until the end. But as I have gotten older and experienced more things and thought about things differently, I experience time and I think of time in a more circular fashion. I really think it sort of folds in on itself. And if we really like to pin things down and have things make sense, but I think that there's so much of life that is, that we're not fully understanding, or that we are going to understand less of if we insist on sort of like that linear thinking. I can go back to any profound memory from my life at any age. And if I really pause and, allow myself to remember the way the light was, the time of day, the feelings, that it's like that memory is alive somewhere on some timeline. Now, I may have continued on in my life and in my experiences, but that experience that I'm going back to, I think, is still existing on some plane somewhere. And when my mother really took a turn, she was diagnosed with ALS in 2020. And I was writing about this in the personal essay this week. She resisted that diagnosis for months and months. She just absolutely refused to believe that that's what was going on. And my mother was an alcoholic for, the majority of my life, certainly from the time I was 7 or 8 all the way forward. The only time she stopped drinking was when she couldn't swallow anymore and she had a feeding tube. So that occurred the last few months of her life. And I think at that time, she just couldn't believe what was happening to her. She was, when I saw her in August of that year, she would shake her head and shrug, like she just couldn't believe what was happening. And I think her denial muscle was so strong from all the years of drinking and insisting she wasn't an alcoholic, it didn't serve her well. My mother was somebody who really spent a lot of time and energy making everything look perfect on the outside. She, the house was perfect. She was always done. She was always dressed, makeup, hair. She never left the house, with her hair in a ponytail and sweats. Like, that just did not happen. And when I lived in her house, I was also expected to always look right, act right, be right. And so was everybody else in the house. So that energy and that focus of making things look right, if she could do that, she was okay. She could then move about her day. She wasn't actually okay, because if you need to numb out, to that degree every night, you're not okay. It's not working. But that is what drove her. If I can just make things look okay, then I'm going to be okay. And so she wouldn't have the difficult conversation. She was not somebody who would really entertain like a therapeutic process. I tried to go to therapy with her multiple times. She just wasn't someone who was going to have those deeper conversations or really sit with uncomfortable feelings. She didn't understand the point. For her, it was like, no, I'm going to avoid that stuff. Why would I want to feel uncomfortable? Or why would I want to have a conversation that makes me feel bad? Or why would I want to have an email exchange where I have to really think about past actions? Like, I don't want to do any of that. I just want to avoid that and move forward. And it prevented, in my relationship with her, it prevented us from being close, but not just in our relationship. If you're not willing to, if you cannot have difficult conversations, if you can't sit with feelings that are uncomfortable, you're never going to really know yourself or what's driving you or what's stopping you, what's, scaring you. And you're also never going to give other people permission or the kind of environment where they can feel free to share with you. Like, you won't go there. And so that's how things were with her. And she would not admit she was an alcoholic. She would not admit that there was a problem there. The problem was me and my perception that she had a drinking problem. That was the problem. So it was a very gaslighting experience for me growing up, because as I got older and, could see and hear and understand, well, other people's moms are not falling down drunk all the time, or like, I started to understand this is not me or my perception. This is a real thing that's happening in our household, and no one is, no one is dealing with it. No one is talking about it. No one is getting her help. I really understood as I got older, and especially as I entered my teenage years, she wasn't okay. And it was incredibly painful for me and frustrating that no one else would back me up and try to get her some help or try to get her to understand that she needed some help. It was really the lone voice saying there's a problem here. So, and that's not uncommon. Alcoholics generally surround themselves with either other alcoholics, so they can be drinking together, or enablers, right? People who are going to just enable the behavior for a variety of reasons. Fear, I think, is among the uppermost of those. So, when she got sick, she decided that was not the correct diagnosis, and that it was my fault that she was having these speech issues. And I'm writing about that in the memoir, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but things had transpired between us. Every once a decade or so, I would try to say to her, Mom, you really do have a problem, and that is the issue between us, and it's affecting so many different facets of your life, and it's just, like way overdue. Like, if you would just deal with this, then everything else would get easier. So like every 10 years or so, something between us would come to a head, and I would be forced, almost to say something to her. And it would never go well, so then I would just, okay, I tried, and another 10 years would go by. And what I ended up doing, because she wasn't willing to have those conversations, is I just figured out, how do I take care of myself in the context of loving an addict? And that for me looked like moving to the opposite coast. I moved 3,000 miles away. So I grew up in New York City, and I moved to Los Angeles in 2001. And I really did it largely because I knew intuitively that I was never going to be okay in my life. I was so enmeshed with her, and she had such an impact on me that I knew I wasn't really going to be able to start my life and figure out how to heal and how to separate myself from all of that unless I geographically put some distance between us and tried to start my life on my own 2 feet from the ground up. And so I moved out here. And that was probably the best thing I ever did for myself, but also for our relationship, because we then talked a lot, but I wasn't in a situation where I had to subject myself to her drinking anymore. And when I lived in New York and I would get together with her, that would inevitably happen at some point. This way I could have her in my life a lot, but, separate out the drinking. And I would always make sure, I was always doing the math with my mom. I was always figuring out what time of day it is. And this is going to come into play with the conversation about time that I want to dive into today. But I was always doing the math. So I would always be thinking about, what time is it in New York when I go to call her, or if I saw my phone ringing, what time is it for her? Because if it was after 5 p.m. in New York, there was a good chance the Chardonnay had come out, and I didn't want to talk to her at that point. So I was always trying to talk to her earlier in the day. Often when I'd be alone in my car, I'd drop my kids off somewhere and I'd have a little bit of time, I would call her. So that denial muscle that she had didn't serve her when she got sick. And what had happened between us, a few months before she started having symptoms, I sent her an email in October of, I'm just making sure this is right, 2019. Yeah, that's right. And it was one of those once a decade, okay, you've pushed me too far, and now I'm going to have to say a whole bunch of things, and I don't have to. I wanted to communicate some things to her and reassert some boundaries and kind of try one last time to really explain to her my perspective and why things were the way they were between us. And so I did that, and I sent her an email. I worked on that email for, over a week. I let myself write the rage version. Things had happened. She behaved in a certain way. She did some things. She really, it was very unprovoked kind of attack because she had been drinking, and she sort of like drunk texted me. And I just decided, you know what, that's it. And here we go. Like, I'm going to say a whole bunch of things now. And I did, and I sent the email, but I sent the softest version of the email that I could. I let myself write the rage one. I put it in drafts. I went back the next day and I worked for a week just kind of like taking out all of the stuff that I could, so that what I was left with was the softest, gentlest version of the truth, and I sent it to her. But my mother could never be wrong. And you may have people like this in your life, and you may love an addict. And if those two things are true, or either of those things are true, you're really going to relate to this conversation. It's very hard to love people who are never wrong. They will never ever own it or apologize or acknowledge, their part in an interaction. It's always, it's always you. It's always the other person, or there's always an excuse, or there's always a reason, for why they behave the way that they did. If you have someone like that in your life, it's so difficult. It's infuriating and frustrating, and it also prevents intimacy because nobody's right all the time. None of us. I'm not, you're not. There's literally not a single one of us who's always right and always getting it right. And there's just, we all make mistakes. We all show up in a way that we wish we hadn't later sometimes. We all say things or do things that in retrospect, like if we could go back, we'd make a different choice. It's just part of the human experience. We're not going to operate at our best level all the time, every second. And so when you can just own that and say, I'm really sorry, like I screwed that up. I really apologize to you. And then you take some time and figure out, why didn't I show up in the way that I wish that I had in that moment? Like, what was happening with me? Or was I triggered? Or was I exhausted? Or like, what happened? So you can understand yourself and do it differently the next time and apologize in a meaningful way that makes the other person feel heard and understood. Then you've got an environment where real intimacy can occur, because you're being accountable for your own behavior and your own actions, and you're also giving the other person the opportunity to know that you're there and know that you're going to, if something happens between you, you're going to be able to work it out. And imago therapy has a beautiful sort of concept around this that I just love. When I first heard it, I thought, oh my, that's it, and the idea is that relationships, if you and I are in a relationship, it's not happening inside me and it's not happening inside you. That relationship is happening in the space between us, and I'm responsible for what I'm contributing to that space, and you're responsible for what you're contributing. And then our relationship is that third thing that we're co-creating. And when you enter relationships that way, it's so beautiful, right? You can really create something that is just amazing and thriving and growing. If you're going to put your list of ways you've been wronged, like if you're list keeping in your head, or your frustration or your boredom or your resentment, then it's probably not going to go well. But if you can put your attention, your kindness, your patience, your willingness to understand, your humor, your accountability, like you're going to build something really beautiful. And that idea of relationships, that's for every relationship in your life. Like even your barista, when you go to order a coffee, there's space between you and that person, and you have an opportunity to contribute something beautiful to that space or not. We all have those opportunities all day long. When you're driving, you're in a relationship with the drivers around you, so you have an opportunity to let them merge or to cut them off. Like, it's up to you what you're going to do, and it's up to other people what they're going to do. You can't control that, but you can really work on, what am I contributing as I'm going through the day, whenever I'm in relationship to anyone or anything. You have relationships with inanimate object, like you have a relationship with money, you have a relationship with time, you have a relationship with everything, right? We're all in a relationship with everything around us all the time. And so what are you contributing? And your presence is usually the best thing you can be contributing, your kind attention, your desire to really show up with love and with patience and with an open mind and open hands and open heart. Like, these are all beautiful things that we can all be working on. What other people are going to do, say, want, need, feel, we don't get to control that, but we can certainly work on our own contributions and also the way we're responding to the things that are happening. So timelines, right? And this idea of time being linear. We're going along and it feels that way, right? Every we celebrate New Year's, we celebrate birthdays. Like we keep marking time as if, okay, now I'm 1 year from the year I was born, and 2 years and 3 years and 10 years and 20 and 30. But in reality, if you are, if you start to look at things in a less structured fashion, like these structures are all self-created. We human beings, we like things to make sense. We like to be able to nail things down and understand them. We like to be able to, count on things, or feel that we have some control over our destinies. So we have our routines, we have our calendars, we have time, we have schedules, we have deadlines, we have the things that were, our to-do lists. And if you maybe you go grocery shopping the same day every week, or if you go to yoga, you put your mat down in the same place every class, or you've got your things, right, that make you feel like you can count on certain things happening a certain way. If you have been alive long enough, you understand that on any day at any time, that entire thing can be turned on its head. Anything, any random Tuesday, something can happen, just bam, out of nowhere, and your whole timeline goes out the window, and your routines they're meaningless. They're not going to happen. So we know that intuitively. We just don't like to think about it because it makes us feel vulnerable and vulnerable, like anything could happen at any time. Underneath that, we also know that we have expiration dates and that we don't know when they are. We don't know how much time we have. We don't know how much time anyone else has, particularly the people we love. So it's a really vulnerable undertaking to be a human being and to be awake and alert and aware of all of that all the time. And so there are a lot of people who kind of avoid thinking about it. And culturally, here in the United States, we really don't talk about death very much. And I think in other cultures where it is talked about more and it is part of a more continuous conversation, people are a little less shocked when it happens. I think here it does feel shocking. And so when my mother got sick, I had sent this email. She had not responded for a few months. Then she did. I tried to engage in a real conversation with her, hoping, it's 50 at this point, hoping maybe we could just finally dig in and get somewhere and really, I wanted to be close to her. That is all I ever wanted, with my mother. I loved her to the ends of this earth, but some of you may know it's really hard to love an addict. And if they will not or cannot get themselves help, if they can't pull themselves out of that, then your only hope is boundaries, right? Your only hope is, how do I have this person in my life and keep myself sane? So that was a huge part of my practice for decades and decades. I love my mother. I want her in my life. I want her in my children's lives. How do I maneuver around the alcoholism that she will not admit that she has or do anything about, right? And that was my relationship with her. And it was a huge part of my relationship with her, an ongoing, continuous part that was painful. And every once in a while, when she would lash out or just behave in a really disappointing way, which she did, I would just get to a breaking point where I'd be like, it's the once a decade moment where I'm going to say a bunch of things here. And so anyway, she decided that my email was the cause of her speech problems, her illness, so she wasn't accepting this diagnosis. And every doctor she went to, and I didn't write about this, but I am writing about it in the memoir, that was her first opening, point. My daughter sent me a very upsetting email. The shock of the email, caused me to have these problems. And so it's not, a motor degenerative thing. It's my daughter. And in every medical record, that is there. It exists. And I know that because she made sure that I saw that. So it's really painful, and honestly, one of the most of all the gaslighting things that happened in my relationship with her, that was the gaslightiest, you know? It was like the penultimate, like, wow, okay, so now I'm gonna, because I expressed myself, um, and she behaved in a way that was extremely disappointing and hurtful, and I called her out on it. Because of that, I'm now being blamed for this horrific thing that is happening to her, this devastating, heartbreaking thing that is happening to her. And I'm also being expected to show up and fight for her, which I did. There was no question about whether I was going to do that or not. I absolutely did. But it was a real mind, like, to go through. It was really difficult. And I had spent so many years of my life identifying the gaslight when it would happen, right? Like, for my own sanity and my own well-being, I had become expert at recognizing and understanding when I was being required or asked to not face reality as it was, but as she wanted to pretend it was. That was a constant request on her end. And again, some of you may relate to that. People who are, something has happened between you. I don't know if even on a smaller level, if you are ever with a person and something is happening between you, but it isn't being acknowledged, that is such a bizarre, can we all pause for a minute and recognize what I'm talking about here? Like, you're sitting at lunch with someone and I'm trying to think of something, but something is happening there at the table between you and it isn't being addressed. There is dishonesty occurring in the space between you. You both know this thing is happening and no one is saying anything about it. There's no room for intimacy here. There's no room for trust. There's no room for, like, real understanding, because you're both ignoring the elephant that's sitting at the table with you. And so that was what was going on with my mother. She just would not go there. And so she was now asking me to show up. And she wasn't even asking. There wasn't a question as to whether I was going to show up. This was during the pandemic. So I'm having all these Zoom meetings with her team of 12 doctors and the neurologists and the social workers and the people who would organize different equipment that she might need as her illness progressed. And she sent some of those things back because she was so adamant that she did not have ALS. And it was rough. Like, she stopped taking the medication. There's something called Riluzole, and that is the only medication that they have for ALS patients at this point, and it doesn't cure it. Nothing cures it. It's a progressive disease, but it slows it down. She stopped taking it because it was killing her appetite, and because she didn't think she really had ALS. She genuinely wanted to believe the shock of my email, even though it was things I had said to her, many times before, that was the cause. So it was really, that whole experience was painful, exhausting, mind-bending, that whole year leading up to what eventually happened. And then she ended up in the hospital. And it was very sudden, and there's a whole bunch of things there that I'm also writing about, but that quick sort of decline did not happen for no reason. And so the call and the whole, when she was suddenly being raced to the hospital, really, it was a shock, and it changed everything. And I did happen to be having a matcha latte at Time Cafe when my brother called me, and I didn't put that together until I was writing the essay. But that is kind of where my normal life and the normal timeline that I was on, it ripped, because I went into that hyper-vigilant mode. If you grew up in a lot of uncertainty, you probably have this gear in you that is all about survival. And when I got the phone call, at that time, my brother and I were both my mother's health proxies, and so they could not intubate her unless both of us were in agreement. So they called me. And the doctor, my mother didn't want to be intubated. She had told us that in August. This was November. But the doctor said, I think there's something else causing the breathing issue that is not the ALS. So at that point, I said intubate, because he needed time to investigate or she would have died right then. And then at that moment, everything changed in an instant. And I was in that hyper vigilant, like, what needs to happen? And what happens in my brain, and those of you who grew up with a lot of uncertainty, or you grew up with an addict, or you grew up with violence, or all of the above, you know what gear I'm talking about. It is the gear where everything else disappears and you're just thinking in this very logical fashion of like, okay, what needs to happen first, second, third, fourth, fifth? Like, what do I need to do? And you're just doing it. It's like this hyper focused, these are the things that are going to happen. And so I drove home in that state, and it is like your eyesight, your hearing, everything is a little bit heightened. You feel almost like an animal, like a wild animal operating on high alert. And I went home, I grabbed a bag, I threw things in the bag, I got online, I booked a flight, I hugged my husband, I hugged my children, and I went. And that was the beginning of living that way for a month, of just, okay, and my mother was very organized and very controlling, and a lot of times people who are the most controlling have been the most hurt, and they are trying to avoid pain for themselves and the people they care about by controlling everything. And that was her to a huge degree. My mother had her own trauma growing up. Her father died when she was 13, very suddenly. Her mother died when she was 24. My dad left. She just had a lot of, her brother died, also of a heart attack very suddenly when I was 17. So she lost her family of origin really young, and always just like in an instant. And so that was her trauma. And I think that her response to that trauma was to try to control everything and everyone. And all of us rebelled against that to some degree. I rebelled in my ways. My brother rebelled in his. My stepdad, we all had to figure out how we were going to respond to all of that desire to, pin things down and have things go a particular way. And if you did not agree with her, if you pushed back, or if you, resisted, you would incur her wrath. So there's a lot of that going on, trying to avoid that. So we all, I instantly went into that survival mode of like, okay, what do we need? What needs to happen? I got to New York. Got to her hospital room. And from that moment forward, things were just, I was outside of the normal timeline of my life. And if you've been through this kind of thing, then you'll understand what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, I'm so sorry to say that there's probably going to be a time in your life where that happens. And it generally happens around grief, around losing an entire person that we just, don't know how. How can the timeline move forward without this person? I can't conceive of that. Like I can't conceive of that. I can't see or have any sense of how the earth is going to keep spinning and this person isn't going to be here on the earth with me anymore. Like I can't wrap my head around that. Or you're in that state of trying to save someone's life in any way that you can, even though if you're talking about an illness like this, you're probably quite powerless, but you still want to try. And so you're just in a state of everything changes. You're outside of your daily routine, your schedule, all that stuff goes out the window, and you have a new life and a new schedule and a new set of priorities that are, just completely outside of what is your normal life. And that is what I experienced. I was suddenly mostly living in New York City, which is where I grew up. So that alone, like, I don't know how you feel about your own hometown, or if you still live in your hometown or you've moved away, but those places that live in our bones, when I go back to New York City, it's like the city is inside of me, or I'm in, however it is, it's like that never goes away. When I'm walking the streets of New York City, it's like it really feels like being home, and the rhythm and the energy and the colors and the sounds, just all of it is home. And so I was having that experience. I was sleeping in the room that I grew up in, extremely trippy experience. I was, as I wrote about, flying home once a week to look at my kids, look at my husband, hug them, touch them, and it just almost was, it was really very much like a touchstone. Like I needed to come home and look at them and be with them, just even overnight, just because I felt so untethered. So just, yeah, like on another plane, another dimension. And those are my people, my children and my husband, those are my people. And so, and home is my place of, where I feel grounded. And so to be sort of feeling like I'm somewhere else was just such, it was a really strange, uncomfortable feeling, because I've worked so hard to create this beautiful home, with these people. And then suddenly it was like I'd almost gone back in time or forward in time or out of time. And I'm pretty much living in the ICU with my mother and fully taking on her care, advocating for her, trying to figure out what the next right decision was. At a certain point, she made me her health proxy completely. And I think she did that because she realized that if push came to shove and somebody had to make the most painful decision, I was probably the only one that was going to be able to do it. And I think that was the case. It was very painful. Everything is heightened when you're in the ICU with someone, and everything between my mother and I was heightened. Everything, every moment, everything. Every time I came busting through the door, and we looked at each other, so as painful as it was, and as outside of time as it was so healing, because I think she finally realized on her deathbed, like, clearly my daughter loves me. She's flying, back and forth, like all the time. She's living here with me in the ICU, and why would she be doing that, otherwise? Like, there was no other logical explanation. And not just there with her, but fighting for her and talking to the doctors and asking questions and pushing back. And, it was just a constant. I was playing the Shirley MacLaine role in, terms of endearment. Like, I was fighting for her. And so I think for her, it became really obvious, like, okay, wait a second. Clearly, all these decades, the problem has been the alcoholism and her rage. She had a real rage that she would unleash on me. And I think it finally landed. Plus, this first time in her life, she had been sober continuously for a long time. And all the control she had been trying to exert, it was just pointless. It's just like, that's over. Any idea that she had that she was running the show, or she was the queen and she was, passing out edicts. I mean, it was just like, okay, clearly I'm not in control of anything here. I'm not even in control of my own bodily functions anymore. She was just stripped of everything. And so I think what happened for us is just, she realized that, everything I had been saying to her all those years was real. And I realized that she did love me in her own, kind of twisted way. She did love me, and there was so much love between us, and it had been such a twisty, like, deep-rooted love, and on top of it was all this, it was so difficult and painful, and there's so much hurt there, and I do think, and what helped me in my relationship with her, was understanding that a lot of the time her 13-year-old self, the self she was when her father suddenly died, right, was running her show. And when I could relate to her that way, things went better. When I could understand there is a scared 13-year-old girl here who is terrified, it made things easier between us. I was constantly doing both sides of the equation in our relationship. She would do things, say things, and it would be so painful and so hurtful, and I wouldn't even at a certain point in time bother trying to call her out on anything because I knew she wouldn't be able to have those conversations. So I would do that work of, she's enraged, she's in pain, she's got her own trauma and her own issues that are preventing her from showing up in a loving way. I would do both sides of the equation, and so that I could get to a place of forgiveness, even for an apology I never got. I learned how to do that, and a lot of my own my yoga practice, so much of it was about learning like how to honor my own feelings of pain and betrayal as your mother, right? Like, she's supposed to, quote unquote, be your best friend, your biggest supporter, your biggest fan. And I had such a strange, that just wasn't, she would drink and it would really look and feel like she hated me. And I knew there was just as I got older, I had theories about what was going on there. And I think my theories were correct. I think she did blame me on some really, I don't know if it was unconscious or somewhat conscious level, for the end of her marriage to my father. And I think there's 20 years between them. He was 20 years older. And I think in some way her relationship with him was wrapped up in her relationship with her own dad. So I think she's kind of blaming me for the loss of her father again, kind of a thing. But it was just a lot of me, if we go back to that imago therapy idea and two people being accountable for what they're putting into the space, that is not what I had with her. What I had with her was me trying to be putting my love, patience, but also, care for my own heart and my own well-being into that space between us, and then doing the work when she would throw her rage into the mix, or her frustration, or her disappointment, or her anger, whatever it was, her demands, I would then try to do that work for her as well. So it was, it prevented us from being close the way that I wanted us to be. And I think the way she wanted us to be, even though she wasn't doing any of the things you need to do in order to make that happen. So I wanted to talk about this topic of grief because it is a common human experience we're all going to go through at some point or another, but also this idea of time and being outside of your timeline, and also thinking about your timeline anyway, and whether thinking about time in this linear fashion is really helping you, or if it's even really the right idea. I think for most of us, if we think about, we talk about time travel, it's such a fascination with human beings, and there's so many books and films, but I do think time travel is possible in your own mind and in your own body. I think you can kind of put yourself back to almost anything that is highly memorable to you if you just pause and give yourself a minute to remember what it felt like, and what it smelled like, and what it looked like, and what it, sounded like, and what you were feeling. You can probably go back to those experiences anytime you want. And on some level, I think, on some timeline somewhere, they're still happening. And, if you are imagining things that could happen in your future, there's a real effect in the now on your nervous system. So if you start imagining something, and I don't want you to do this, but if you start imagining something really painful, you will have you can just raise your blood pressure with your own thoughts. You can get yourself into a state of panic just with your own thinking. And so I have come to a place in my own thinking about time and human beings where I feel like time is folding in on itself, kind of like overlapping, and that there's probably so much going on that we either don't understand, or maybe we could understand more if we let go of this idea of a line that we're moving forward along. We just sort of understood that it's like more of a circle, less rigid, and that perhaps, this experience I had as my mother was dying, that timeline was occurring at the same time life in Los Angeles was continuing, and life in New York City was continuing for everyone around us. And part of what kept me okay, and this is kind of the final thing I wanted to touch on, is what tethers you when the ground is falling out from underneath you. What and I mean you personally, like, what is it that you hold on to? What keeps you connected to this world and to your life? And I'm going to guess that it's people and it's places that are really meaningful for you. And my lifeline during that whole month was walking back and forth from the hospital every day. So I was walking 12 miles a day to and from the hospital, and I needed it. I needed it like you need oxygen, I knew as I was walking across Central Park on my way to Mount Sinai, I knew I was going to be inside this ICU all day. And the ICU, if you haven't been in one, it is really like its own ecosystem. It has its own, like, you'll never know what time of day it is because the lighting is always the same. People might start turning their fluorescent lighting off as the day gets closer to nighttime, but it's pretty hard to tell what time it is. It doesn't really matter. You can spend 12 hours in the ICU with someone you love and it feels like 2 hours. It's time is just, it doesn't exist in the same way inside of the ICU. And I think it's because it's such a high stakes environment and there's so much grief in the mix, and everyone can feel everybody else's grief. All the people around my mother in the ICU, and this was during COVID times, there were so many people on ventilators. There were so many family members who looked like mirrors. I'd pass people in the hallway and I think that they look exactly the way I feel. Like we're walking in a nether world right now. We're somewhere between life and death. Like we're in that in between space. And it's a painful space to be living in, and it is a tender space. And there's really nothing more vulnerable. The social worker that was assigned to my mother's case and to my family was, I don't even know what I would have done without her. She was amazing. So she was a tether, she was, people deal with grief in different ways, and you really don't know how someone is going to respond until you're in it with them. You don't know how you're going to respond. For me, I was in that room with her 12 hours a day. Nothing could pull me out of there except like running to the bathroom or, getting some water once in a while. Other people who loved her dearly could not handle it. It just was so devastating to see her like that. And when I went to write the essay, I knew that I had taken pictures of the city from those walks. That's what I would send pictures home to my kids, to my husband. I talked to them every day. I needed to talk to them every day. I needed to, make sure my kids were okay, obviously, but also just like have that connection. It was a lifeline. And I wanted them to know where I was and know what I was doing, but not to see what my mother was going through. So I would take pictures of the city as I was walking, and I would text them, or I would take a video. It started snowing one day, and obviously we don't get a lot of snow in Santa Monica, so I took a video, but I found all these pictures of my mom, and they're just, they just rip your heart out. They're so absolutely brutal and heartbreaking, and that is what everyone in the ICU is dealing with on some level. You wouldn't be in the ICU otherwise. So it's not a place where anybody wants to end up, and it is its own space. And those leaving there at the end of the day, walking over in the morning, it was almost like I was breathing in all the life, all the life from Central Park, from people walking by, from the cars racing by, just absorbing as much of that frequency as I could, so that when I would head into the ICU for the day, I had something where I couldn't eat. I could not eat. I had zero appetite, but I couldn't even even if I wanted to eat, I just couldn't do it. Once in a while I would be, I need to eat, I'm going to pass out. So I would eat at night, once in a while, but you're operating at a different level. You don't need the same things that you need, on a regular day. And so the life in the city is what I needed and what I was living off of. And then I would leave there at the end of the day at 9 o'clock and walk home. And, this is an aside, but I see posts all the time, and I know media has so much to do. People are, is New York or do you feel safe in New York? I grew up in New York City, okay? I was born in New York City. I grew up there. I'm just letting you know, it is the same as ever. Don't believe the hype. It is the same as it has ever been, which means, yes, you have to keep your wits about you. Yes, you have to pay attention on the streets. The end. That's all. You got to be street smart, but it's, I walked home, and it took an hour, from 9 to 10 p.m., and I walked all the way for a whole month, and I never had a problem. So that. But the pre-holiday time in New York City is such a beautiful, special time. I almost felt like the timing here, at least, as brutal as this is a gift, because it's my favorite time in the city. The city kind of gets dressed up, for Thanksgiving, for all the holidays. And there's a feeling to that too. And I think it was almost like I would leave feeling so devastated and so scared and so heartbroken, just so deeply sad. And then as I walked home, I'd feel some of that pre-holiday excitement and see all the lights and Macy's lit up and, tree at Rockefeller and people ice skating, and just kind of that reassurance that, as brutal as all of this is, the earth is going to keep spinning here, even if it feels like it couldn't. And that's the last thing I wanted to say today, is that, when you're grieving, it's so common to feel alone in your grief, because the timeline is going on for everyone else. The earth is still spinning, people are celebrating, everyone's in their routines, their normal routines, going to the grocery store. It's just in your experience, it feels impossible that there's anyone anywhere buying milk. It's just doesn't seem like that could be happening. But it is happening, and it's good that it's happening, and life is going to, continue on, and things are going to keep changing. I will say that the day after my mother passed, I had the first panic attack of my life. And I had certainly I knew I'd worked with so many people who have had so many overwhelming anxiety, but I'd never had an actual panic attack before. And I think what happened for me is I walked out of the building that I had grown up in, and the building that my mother had walked out of 9 million times, and the block that she walked down. And it was only 12 hours later, and I just realized she's never going to walk through this lobby again. She's never going to walk down this block again. She's not on this planet anymore. And I panicked because I didn't know where she was. I had no sense of where is she right now. And it's that's a painful feeling, to love someone so much and then not know. I will say that after about 10 months, I started to really feel her with me. It didn't for the first 10 months. I kept asking, even in my dreams, could I just dream about her tonight? Could I dream about her tonight? So it took time. And I think that part of that is just massive grief flooding your system probably overwhelms everything else. So you're not maybe going to, and I think everyone's different. So maybe other people feel their person around them sooner, maybe later, but I do feel her around me all the time now, and that is very comforting. And I am really grateful that we were able to heal our relationship. That does not happen for everyone. And there is a part of me that, I mourn for all the time we lost, that we could have been so close the way that we were those last 2 weeks of her life. But I'm grateful that I got that. Like, I'm really grateful. If she had passed away and I'd never had it, that would have been so much more painful to have to live with. The other thing is your relationship with the people who have passed doesn't end. Like, death does not end the relationship. You're still in relationship with them. You keep evolving, and the way you think about them keeps evolving, and the way you think about the relationship keeps evolving. And so just, again, with this timeline and this idea we have of like the start and the finish of things, I think it's really naive. I think there's way more going on here that, we're only using whatever percentage of our brains we're using. I think there's so much more happening that we just don't understand. And if nothing else, maybe you can trust in that. Like, there's a lot that you don't know. I think the timelines that we conceive of, I think they're more like interlaced, and the different planes that things are happening on are connected, even if we can't, cross the barrier. When I was giving birth to my son, I will tell you, we had such an intense birth experience. There's a saying in Swahili, at the moment of birth, the mother's grave opens for a moment. And I tell you what, when I heard that after the birth, I thought that is what I experienced. And so I just think there's a veil here instead of this final thing that we think of, this solid thing that we think of. I think the veil between being here alive on this planet and not being here, I think it's more like a thin veil instead of like this, very solid sort of like cliff that we think, okay, that person's gone now. They're just maybe somewhere that it's harder to access. That's what I think now. Who knows if I'm right, but that's what I feel. I really hope that this has been helpful to anyone who is grieving, anyone who's lost someone, anyone who has felt outside of their own timeline. I don't really think this gets talked about enough, and I think that's one of the reasons people feel so alone inside the experience. Also, I think there's fear for a lot of people to bring up loved ones who have passed because they're afraid they're going to like remind the person. You never forget, so you never have to worry like, ooh, should I bring it up because maybe they're having a good day. It feels good to talk about the people that you love so much, even if they're not here anymore. So and thank you for joining me for this talk. And I'm always available if there's anything that I mentioned that you would like to dive into further, or that you're struggling with, or that, anything that you just want to like talk about more. I'm so here for it, and I'm easy to find. And I really, really thank you for joining me for this talk, and I'll see you soon.